Appreciate being here. Yes, yesterday we lost 20 degrees per time zone as we traveled, so 82 to 22. So yeah, not a warm welcome, but we're glad to be here. It's been 9 months since we left Louisville, and fun to come back, still know our way around, and to be able to see friends here, both from Southern and from church, and delighted to be here with you. As Ken said, human flourishing in the area of economics has been one that's been a part of my life for a long time, and vocationally, in that I worked in the banking world for a season. I've spent time in the pastorate. I've spent time in the academy. And as director of the Evangelical Theological Society, in all reality, my day-to-day operations are primarily as a CFO, managing the society's resources and its logistics. So this intersection of faith and work and the theology of work has really been something that through the Lord's providence has been woven into my life in a way that's allowed me to kind of unpack my own struggles with it over time and then also help the church think about it. So what I want us to do today is to think about this idea of subduing the earth, an account of human flourishing in the presence of sin. Now, I've argued elsewhere, and as Ken mentioned, this talk is actually online on the Commonweal website from a colloquium that we did, I think, about a year ago. And in that, I argued that the account of humanity's creation in the image of God in Genesis 1 is specifically crafted to lead the reader to conclude that God's intended outcome, his purpose for creating humanity in his image, was to create flourishing communities, not just flourishing individuals. The cultural or creation mandate, as it has been called, God's command to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill and subdue the earth, and to rule over the living things on the earth is rightly seen as a command to fulfill God's intention. Humanity is to fill the earth and bring about flourishing. As clear as the divine intention is in the text, there are many questions which surround the mandate now that we live in a post-Genesis 3 world. True human flourishing is more than economics and advancement. It includes a right relationship with God, which was broken in the fall, healthy relationship with others, which were broken in the fall. It includes a God-honoring relationship with the creation itself, which again was broken in the fall. Without each of these, there may be glimpses of flourishing, an echo of the goodness seen in God's intent for humanity, but not true and complete human flourishing. Now, with all that said, human flourishing is not less than economics either. It includes this holistic perspective, but it's not complete without economic flourishing as well. Notice, for instance, if we fast forward to Jesus' statements in the Sermon on the Mount, do not be anxious, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. What are these things to which he refers? Well, it's our lives and what we eat and what we drink and what we wear. It is not the case that these are unimportant things, that they are excluded from the flourishing life of the kingdom. Far from that. We ought not worry about them because our Father knows our needs, and just as he cares about the intimate details of the animal world that we are to oversee as part of the mandate, so too he cares for us. Yet the most important thing is to understand and pursue our relationship with him, the kingdom and his righteousness. To put him in Genesis terms, we need to realize he is our creator and we are made in his image. That is foundational to the activities and needs of flourishing that are found in the mandate's command. So flourishing in both the Old and the New Testaments is more than economics, but it is not less than that. So if we're to understand our flourishing, we must situate work appropriately. This is all the more critical today as we live in a culture where increasingly economics, that is to say business and work, is increasingly seen to be the source of what's wrong and not an essential component of flourishing. Alongside these questions related to work and economics, the seemingly harsh language of ruling and subduing has been subjected to extended critique. Some have even asserted that this language is at the heart of the planet's ecological troubles. It also seems to play into the idea that all business and economic activity is just one person taking advantage of another. My goal this morning is not to spend a significant amount of time on the critiques per se, but rather in light of them to explore two threads in the biblical account of creation. First, I want to consider where work, economics, and business fit in creation. What's the theological location of work and economics? And second, I want to follow the text account of how flourishing might continue in a post-sin world. To do this, we'll explore the concepts of ruling and subduing to see how they are connected to our role as stewards of God's creation and to the flourishing in a sinful environment. In short, our goal this morning is to answer the question, how do we flourish in the presence of sin? So consider with me, if you will, Okay. There we go. A thought experiment about the proper location of business. Now, much has been written about God's work in the act of creation and Adam and Eve's work in the garden. So you might think of something like Jeff Van Duser's work, where he goes through Adam and Eve's commands to keep and serve the garden and to locate work in that environment. But I actually want us to back up and to focus on the mandate itself and its relationship to business. Now, follow along with me in just kind of a little thought experience here. What might the mandate have looked like if sin had not occurred in chapter 3? I think this is important for us to do. Humanity is to be fruitful and to multiply. Now, initially, this means, obviously, that Adam and Eve need to have children. Their children need to have children, and so on, so that humanity multiplies. Eventually, the Father's house will grow beyond its capacity, and new homes will be built. Eden's garden will be expanded into new territories, and eventually a whole new human settlement will arise, and that process will continue all over the globe in fulfillment of God's command. Now, with this geographical spread, the question we have to ask is, will all humans continue to farm exactly as Adam and Eve have been doing in the garden? Are the places humans will live, do some of them have different opportunities? Are there places in the environment where herding is better than farming, where sheep will do better than cattle, where certain natural resources occur that are not found elsewhere? Will every community have sufficient wood, bitumen for waterproofing, stone for quarrying? Just consider the description of the rivers flowing out of Eden. Havilah has good gold, right? A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. Consider this description. If Havilah's gold is noted for its quality, it seems then that there's gold in other places that might not be of as high a quality. And if we have noticed that there's onyx and bdellium there, then there are places potentially where those resources do not exist. It seems to imply that the resources are what we need, but they're varying resources in varying geography. Although this is subtle, the text would seem to imply that business, specifically trade, will be necessary for each community to have the resources that it needs, especially those resources not found in its own locale. This will be a requirement and not an option once humanity truly spreads across the face of the earth. Even without currency as we know it, trade, equitable exchange of goods, will allow each community to utilize its resources to gain what it needs from another community, while at the same time enriching the other community with needs that they have. So let's continue this thought experiment just a bit further outside Genesis 1 and 2. What about the individual skills of specific human beings? Shortly after the fall, we are introduced to a myriad of specialized occupations, like shepherds and farmers, musicians and metalworkers. See Genesis 4 for this. After the fall, we see the construction of cities and civilizations. These are post-fall fulfillments of the necessary conditions for human obedience to the creation command. These developments highlight the complementary and cooperative nature of the task God has given us. Just as male and female must complement each other, not be the same, and must cooperate together for humanity to multiply, so too communities must work together and draw upon the varied talents and gifts of the society. The growth of humanity requires economic cooperation, governmental structures and order, and the participation of each member. We see this pattern continue in Exodus 31, where God announces that he has gifted Bezalel and Oholiab and other skilled men with both mental and physical skills necessary to materially produce the tabernacle. This natural gifting and the skills and trades necessary for the construction of the temple fits perfectly with the gifts given by the Spirit for the building of the kingdom. You see, it's God's consistent pattern to equip individuals to work cooperatively and in complementary fashion with those around them to accomplish his purposes. Again, think through this in terms of business and work. A basic tenet of economics is what the economists will call comparative advantage. That means that there will be something that you can produce more efficiently and less expensively than I can. And so it's a better use of our resources for you to make that, for me to do something else with my time and energy that fits my skill set, and then we trade. We use our economic resources to gain those goods from another. Companies that we see go out of business often go out because they're working in an area where they lack a comparative advantage to someone else. So we should do what we are better at doing, what we are gifted at doing, what God has uniquely made us to do. So the spread of humanity into varied geographic environments with varied natural resources naturally leads to trade. Specialized work related to these resources and related to the multiplicity of skills God gives to different humans naturally leads to business. And all of this is accounted for in a world without sin as it was created, wholly good and fitting for God's images to dwell in obedience to him. We need to consider then that if this is how we've been designed, that we need to think of work differently. We need to think of work not as worship, really, not that that's one thing that it is, but that work is an act of worship. As Dan Block has defined it in what I think is an excellent book, For the Glory of God, I'd encourage you to read it. Worship, as he has said, involves reverential acts of submission and homage before the divine sovereign in response to his gracious revelation of himself in accord with his will. Intentional word choices in the text indicate that we should understand Adam's work as worship. Adam was placed, literally caused to rest in the garden by God in order to work and keep it. Rest points forward literally to Noah and the deliverance from the flood, and to the rest Israel would have from their enemies in the land. The terms work and keep are understood literally in the garden, but later they'll be used to describe temple service and the people's relationship to God's revelation. Adam's work is his intentional and reverential response to God's provision and a pointer forward to later work and worship. Jonathan Wilson's sage analysis of the relationship between worship, blessing, and the creation mandate to flourish is worth quoting in full. He says here that, I don't have that one, so I'll read that one for you. Worship is the fullest enactment and extension of God's blessing. It is the work of the people that enacts our conviction that creation is a blessing that gives to us the settling and resources for living. In worship, we are most fully alive, but we must not draw a firm line between the work of worship and other work that we must do. We must distinguish between worship work and other work, but we must not separate them or put them in opposition to each other. Although there is a clear difference, the Sabbath command reveals this. Worship work and other work together make it possible for us to enjoy God's blessing in creation. True human flourishing is worship. To the extent that good things, flourishing things that happen in individual lives, marriages, families, societies, or economies are disconnected from the worship of God, they are to that extent truly not fully flourishing. They are poor and dim reflections of flourishing, but they've been cut off from the blessing and the source of life. Now, it's clear from the Old Testament that not all work and not all worship is flourishing. False worship is consistently described in work language. You might follow this sort of tragic train of Old Testament thought. We are the work of God's hands, his economic output, as it were. Our economic produce is referred to as the work of our hands, but idols are also the work of our hands. When work ceases to be done within the framework of our identity, our creation in the image of God, we direct our worship to the economic output, whether literal idols, vocation, or resources, or social standing. This is dangerous territory because, as Psalm 115 clearly teaches, we become what we worship. Worshiping the Creator, the source of life, yields life. Worshiping the creation of creatures, cut off from the source of life, yields death. This is why flourishing, which often gets reduced to economic stability and growth, cannot be separated from identity. We are connected to God by creation. But now in the presence of sin, we must be reconnected to God by salvation. We need to be recreated, made anew in the image, so that we might truly reign as his representatives and so that we might truly flourish. As noted above, we see this idea that flourishing is more than a mandate to reign, and we see that it's more than physical well-being in the blessing that precedes the expanded command in Genesis 1:28. Flourishing is holistic, and it is work, and it is worship. It is, in the words of Bloch, our reverential submission and homage before the divine sovereign in response to his revelation of himself. Human flourishing is work, and it is worship. It is holistic, involving all of life, and cannot be separated from the rest of creation, from our physical bodies and lives or our spiritual state. Notice the flow of the text in Genesis 1. The basic structure is a series of volatives that express God speaking things into being. This culminates in the creation of man and the declaration that we should be made in his image. Other parts of the creation are blessed and empowered to flourish. In the creation of humanity, blessing is central, and the blessing and mandate to flourish encompasses our physical creation as male and female, our marriages, our societies, our economies, and humanity as it moves to fill the earth. Now, if we step back a minute and then think about the location of business, it means then that it is also grounded in our creation in the image of God. It's part of what we are to do. So to have business that is somehow separated from identity, not intimately tied both to God's blessing, his provision, his revelation, to not have all that together is to both misunderstand our identity as well as to misconstrue the nature of business itself. That very question is cropping up today in the business community more than it has in probably the last 2 decades. Beginning with the scandals that took place with Enron and other collapses that took place in the economy, business is asking, what is the purpose of business? Okay, so these are not Christian leaders. These are business leaders who are asking, what is the purpose of business? And so Charles Handy, in a 2002 Harvard Business Review article, asked this: we cannot escape the fundamental question, whom and what is a business for? The answer once seemed clear, but no longer. The terms of business have changed. Ownership has been replaced by investment, and a company's assets are increasingly found in its people, not in its buildings and its machinery. The change from a primary investor owner to a group of investors, stockholders, who are not vested but only seek a financial profit has rendered the return to the shareholder as the only real stakeholder null and void. This means that even in the business community, the purpose of business, in other words, is not to make profit, full stop. This is, again, from Handy's article. It is to make a profit so that the business can do something more or better. This something becomes the real justification for the business. Owners know this. Investors needn't care. I'll give you a little picture of what this looks like when you have tension between all the stakeholders in a business and just the shareholders. I worked for a very long season at a large national bank who I won't name because of the story I'm getting ready to tell. And when I worked for them, we had what we called the Supply Olympics. And in the Supply Olympics, the goal was that you, as the good employees of this bank, were to use your own resources to buy. Sam, you could bring paper clips, and Ken, you could bring pencils, and you could bring other resources in so that we would not spend budget money on the supplies that we used in order that we could increase the shareholder value. That was our highest and greatest good. So you bought stock so I can buy paper clips for that company. That's the kind of thing that happens when you move into this realm that the only importance of business is to maximize the profit of those who hold stock in the company. But life doesn't work that way because it's not just about profit. Consider this quote from Dave Packard. I think many people assume wrongly that a company exists simply to make money. While this is an important result of a company's existence, we have to go deeper and find the real reasons for our being. As we investigate this, we inevitably come to the conclusion that a group of people get together and exist as an institution that we call a company so that they're able to accomplish something collectively they could not accomplish separately. They make a contribution to society, a phrase which sounds trite, but which is in fact fundamental. This is surely an echo of flourishing in business. At my school at Biola University, the business school has plaques on many of its walls proclaiming that business is mission. This is a bold and biblical statement that seeks to help us beyond a divided view of sacred and secular, where business is often seen by the church as only a platform for ministry. There's some in the Christian community who stomach business, who hold their nose and tolerate the marketplace in order to have a platform for ministry. Others who readily engage in business as a means of earning a living see only two viable avenues for integrating their faith at work. The first is that they can display Christian character. Not a bad thing. The second is to engage in ministry at work. They conduct Bible studies to encourage believers and to evangelize non-believers. Now, neither of these avenues is bad, yet neither is sufficient for biblical view of business as based in creation. As long as we approach life in a disintegrated way, we will never see business as it is properly located in creation. Now, some have moved beyond this to business as ministry, a mindset that's adopted frequently and moved to business as mission. In this mode, believers see their work as valuable in and of itself, like work in the garden. It is the complementary, cooperative task identified by Handy and Packard in these quotes, but done within an explicitly Christian worldview. This approach views life as an integrated whole, and it both engages in work for the glory of God and for the ministry to both believers and unbelievers alike. It is a model that embraces the proper location of business in human flourishing. I would suggest, however, that we might take one step further and contemplate business as worship. In this way, we fully integrate business in creation, as Wilson has suggested, and see the work of worship and the worshipful work as two parts of an integrated life. These parts are distinct yet not in opposition. Business as worship helps us address the ever-present temptation to view economic flourishing as our provision, as an idol of our own creation, instead of part of God's gracious provision and a blessing which we willingly receive and offer worship for. So, having explored the proper location of work in creation, how it fits in a holistic fashion in our lives, we now have to consider work in a post-fall environment. It must still be cooperative. It must still be complementary. And it must be focused on communal flourishing, including the flourishing of our competitors, our customers, and not just our shareholders. Yet it will be amazingly complicated by sin and the curse and our ongoing temptation to sin. These temptations will include the use and abuse of the environmental resources and our fellow laborers. We must now consider whether the creation mandate exacerbates these temptations or if it includes resources for our post-fall environment. So now we need to think about what it means to rule and subdue the earth. In Genesis 1:26, the express purpose of God's creation of humanity in his image is so that we might rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heaven, over the livestock and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And after detailing the creation of humanity in complementary fashion, as male and female, both in the image of God, the creation mandate is given to us in Genesis 1:28. Here humanity is blessed and directed by God. And we're told, commanded by God, that humanity is to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it, and to rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heaven, and all the things that move on the earth. So what does it mean to rule? So for those of you who rule or have dominion, depending on the translation you use, the Hebrew behind this is the verb radah. Some commentators have expressed great concern that this term is inherently harsh. John Goldingay, for example, argues that radah, quote, is not a term for the regular ruling of a king over a people. It refers to mastery imposed by a foe, mastery exercised by one people over another, close quote. Yet he does note that such texts like Leviticus 25, 39 to 53 introduce the idea that radahing, ruling, right, does not have to be harsh, since these texts instruct the Israelites that you can radah, you can rule without harshness. Even so, Goldingay insists that the term must include compulsion or force as the original command in the mandate. I would suggest that Goldingay's reading suffers from two particular interpretative decisions. First, he actively chooses to only read Genesis 1 in hindsight from the vantage of a post-Genesis 3 world. Although he would later qualify his remarks slightly and place some helpful limits on what this compulsion may and may not entail, he maintains the element of force is necessary because it's found in the sinful environment after Genesis 3. The second weakness is that he chooses to view radah radically differently from other terms for ruling, such as malak, the primary verb to be king, or mashal that we'll see in a number of kingship texts. With regard to the connotation associated with radah, which comes from a word meaning to trample or tread down, I think James Barr is wise to remind us that we should be cautious about assigning the physical sense of any verb. So this verb does mean to trample, like to trample grapes to make wine, something like that. Of transferring that physical sense into other spheres of its use. Oftentimes they're not connected. So he tells us that to dominate this physical sense over the general usage, just because we have some sense that the physical aspect is primary, is nonsense from a linguistic point of view. We simply don't operate languages that way. The verb radah is used quite generally and in positive senses of kingship in, for instance, 1 Kings 4, 21 to 24, where it occurs along mashal with little discernible distinction in use. Interesting, Psalm 72, which Golden Gate omits in his entire discussion of ruling, the prayers that the king might have dominion from sea to sea so that the kingdom and the earth will flourish and there'll be goodness and peace. In the context of Psalm 72, the king's rule, his radah, brings justice, uplifts the poor, establishes prosperity for the people, and abundance in the land. There are enemies in view, but only active opposition seems to call for anything harsher than rule as a primary mean for radah. Humanity is created to rule, but this rule is to be compassionate and not exploitative. Even in the Garden of Eden, he who would be Lord of all must first be servant of all. This is made all the more clear when the context of the command to rule is examined. Ruling is, like image, a royal term. And the royal quality of humanity is an expression of the image of God. Therefore, God's royal acts in Genesis 1 and 2 form the basis for any connotation of what it means for man to rule in the pre-fall environment. So what kind of ruler does humanity image? Humanity expresses the image of a great king who creates environments and fulfills the needs of the earth's inhabitants before they are created. He is creative and compassionate, not rash and reactive. He is concerned for and creates goodness. And most importantly, he is without rival and in absolute control, creating by fiat, not by the conquering of chaos or the defeat of enemies who stand in his way. So in Genesis 1, humanity rules in the same way with the goal of goodness, in consideration of the needs of the inhabitants of the earth, and with a worshipful gratitude for the provision of the earth and its fruitfulness, which is a direct gift from God. Being created in the image of God, humanity expresses a representational reign, not an absolute one. So nothing can be connoted in Genesis 1 of humanity's rule that is not appropriate of God's rule. Humanity is a contingent vice-regent who is responsible to the great king for the stewardship of his creation. Humanity exercises a purposeful vice-regency matched to the flourishing of Eden. Humanity serves and keeps. Humanity does not use and abuse, because humanity's rule is a representational reign. Now, if I'm honest, and I think I have to be, the second term, to subdue, is a bit harder to deal with. It is harsh in its connotations. The underlying Hebrew verb is kavash. Now, it only occurs 15 times, which makes lexical studies a little difficult. We would typically love to see 30 to 50 occurrences to really get at a word's meaning, but we are helped because this word occurs a ton in other literature outside the Bible, especially in Assyrian and Babylonian literature. We have the exact same term in place. Now, if we were to look at this list, the top one here, Genesis 1 through 1 Chronicles 28:10, those are the occurrences of kavash in the Old Testament. They're not a happy list. They refer to subduing enemies by force. They refer to placing people into subjection of slaves. Even in the book of Esther, it's the term for the attempted assault on Esther. These are the kinds of things that are governed by this particular verb. So they are strong and they are harsh occurrences. Now, commentators over the years have tried to tone this down in a variety of ways, recognizing that this is problematic in the good setting of Genesis 1. The most common means of directing the harshness of the term a little bit downward is to view the object earth in agricultural terms. So remember, we're commanded to multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. The it, feminine singular, referring back to the earth. Golden Gate puts it this way. Perhaps this term subdue recognizes that the earth will have to be treated harshly if it is to realize the destiny that God immediately goes on to describe of producing food. To this end, humanity has to attack the earth, break it up, and thus make it usable. Yet, Golden Gate will go on in about 2 sentences to say the attack is nonviolent because Genesis abhors violence. I'm not sure how you can get anything but hermeneutical whiplash from saying they have to attack it and break it up and then say, but it's nonviolent. I don't know how you can put those two together in the way that he has described it. Others will make similar agricultural arguments, suggesting that nothing more is intended here than the basic needs of settlement and agriculture, tilling of the land. One of the most recent attempts in a work dedicated to understanding our creation in the image of God is from Middleton's. Many of you might know The Liberating Image, his classic book. He suggests that although many of the kavash, the subdue text, have to do with the exercise of power over persons with some connotation of violence, quote, texts having to do with subduing the land or the earth, which are probably the most relevant to Genesis 1, in those texts, there is no implication of a violent or adversarial relationship to the land or earth per se, quote unquote. And he references these parallel texts, Deuteronomy 3, Deuteronomy 31, and Joshua 1:15. Well, I like this one, except that it doesn't work if you read anything other than the immediate text. So, Numbers 32, and the land is subdued before the Lord. Then after that you shall return and be free of your obligation to the Lord and to Israel, and this shall be the possession before the Lord. The context is the war to take Canaan. Numbers 32, the people of God and the people of Reuben, every man who is armed to battle, in that case, the land shall be subdued after the battle is over. And then Joshua, then the whole congregation of the people of Israel assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting, and the land laid subdued before them after the conquest. So Middleton can only get to this idea that somehow we have inheritance that is separate from a violent subduing by not reading the immediate verses that these things are about the conquest described in Joshua, which is a particularly violent one. But I think he does perhaps point us in the right direction. If we look at the text where kavash is used with earth or land, it is only used in those cases where earth or land refers to the inhabitants of the earth or land. So the same way we would talk about a nation, the land of Israel, where we would think of it in that context. So in all those places, it's not talking about the earth as the object, like the ground, like Adamah in Genesis 1 and 2, the thing that you're going to farm. It refers to it as land, like it does here in these texts. The land lay subdued means Canaan. What does it mean by Canaan? It means that the Canaanites were subdued in each one of these cases. So it still has a personal object, but the object are the inhabitants of the land. Now stay with me, this is helpful to us because the first problem we're going to encounter is twofold. One is when we get to Genesis 3, Adam and Eve are not going to do their job of ruling over the serpent, which is their explicit command. Neither will they do their job of subduing themselves or one another. And that's one of their first failures. Mark Sosi, in an article that is published this month in Jets, so Jets will be out in about a couple weeks, and you can check that. And he's described ruling and subduing as offensive and defensive terms. Meaning offensive, to rule, to spread God's rule beyond Eden, to make the rest of the world a garden, not implying that there's opposition there, but just spreading that goodness and administering his kingdom. But subdue comes into play when there is finally an opponent in view. And I would suggest that if we look at this and we just go a little chapter further from Genesis 3 to Genesis 4, a similar kind of language is used with Cain, right? Remember, the command to Cain is, you better rule over sin, or sin is going to rule over you. This is the idea that the first instance is to subdue ourselves when the temptation to sin comes. And then when we are engaging in that we are to be subdued by others within the body. It's part of the role of the complementary and cooperative nature in which he has created humanity. So that Genesis 1 and 2 contain both resources for living in the goodness pre-fall, as well as they know what's going to happen and they prepare us for what will come later by providing us with the resources, this idea of subduing opposition to the Lord along the way. I think then that this suggests a better approach to how we view this. And consider how this moves on in the rest of the text, and I'm going to summarize here for sake of time. But think about when we come to Noah, and he comes off of the ark. The command to be fruitful, to multiply, and fill the earth is continued. And the alert reader is going, but wait a minute, I didn't hear anything about ruling or subduing. Is that now gone in the post-fall and now post-flood environment? We get two statements of the blessing and the command to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And in between, what we get in there is the implementation of capital punishment. Humanity is now required to subdue violence within its midst through a judicial implementation. That's what subduing will look like in a post-fall world. It will be the implementation of justice by the community. You have the responsibility to subdue one another. It still leaves the astute reader saying, but what about ruling? We were created so that we would rule. What happens with that? We go a couple chapters later and we meet the family of Terah. We meet the family of Abraham. We get the covenant in Genesis 12, and by the time we make it to Genesis 17, we're told that not only will a blessing come from his line, but there will be a line of kings who will rule, and through the rule, the earth will be blessed. Kingship returns, but it returns in the person of the Messiah as prefigured in the kings of Israel. Now, let me just do this very quickly, and then we'll have some time for Q&A here. I think the biggest thing that we can take away from this is that as soon as all this happens, Abraham and the nation of Israel form itinerant ministries, right? And they go about preaching the word. Well, not really. Abraham does business in Canaan. He farms, he shepherds, he moves around, he lives his life. Israel is not sent as a missionary enterprise. They're sent to live their life so that the nations around them will go, who's your God? Because I look at your life and it's flourishing. And it's in all aspects. It's in their laws that God has given them. It's in the way that they deal with one another in their community. That's what they were designed to do. Now, they failed at that. But the royalty continues with them, and they are to be a royal priesthood, language which is picked up in the church, right? So Jesus brings this forward in the Sermon on the Mount. Do you know who supported Jesus' ministry during his itinerant phase when he's roaming the land with his disciples? 3 women. One of means, probably by marriage, and 2 others who are involved in business. They're funding his ministry, right? Just kind of walk through this with me for a little bit. If there's no business and it's not an integrated whole within the life, there's no funding of Jesus' ministry. For him to not work, but to be supported to go around and do that. In Acts, if there's no business, there's no place to sell the goods that the church will use to fund those believers who don't have enough. There's no selling and giving to the poor if business doesn't exist. There's no Lydia. We don't have these operations for the church to be supported, for pastors to be supported, focusing their work on the word if the church is not actively engaged in business. You notice that Paul is not a missionary when he's supported by the church, but not a missionary while he's making tents. It's not where his paycheck comes from that determines whether or not he's flourishing and whether or not he's doing ministry. It has to do with the nature of how he integrates his life and brings it forward. And I'll end with this. There's one text that I did not bring you of all the ones on subdue, and I'm going to skip a few things here that I think is absolutely critical. Micah 7:19, typically translated as here in the ESV, he will again have compassion on us, and he will tread our iniquities underfoot. So underfoot doesn't occur in the text. What it says is that he will kavash, he will subdue our iniquities, literally. Most of them have assumed, the translators have assumed here, that this is then going back to its physical sense. He's going to trample down our iniquities. But if you take this same word and you run it through what kings do with it in the ancient Near East, it looks like this. This is from the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, and it's a quote from a letter. If the king wants to pardon, PN means personal name, so the name is unimportant, but the king wants to pardon, and that term for pardon is to subdue his offense. Let him do so. The ultimate subduing of sin that will lead to human flourishing will be an act of the king. And that king will be God himself, who will subdue our sins. Now, I'm not saying that this is, in Genesis 1, originally a look forward, but I think by the time that we get here, the scripture calls us to look backwards and say the resource of a king who will rule and reign and ultimately subdue our sin after fall is found in Genesis 1 and is picked up here, and will go forward. And think about the way that Paul uses warfare metaphor, both for what Jesus is going to do and what we will do with ideas and thoughts and the spiritual forces that we wage against. It is war, and we fight under the king who subdues sin. This is a look backwards, a glimpse of the gospel in the garden, where one day the king, the one true human, Jesus Christ, will forgive sin and offer that to his people. So human flourishing is grounded in creation, God's blessing, and in his new creation. Personal subduing of sin and communal subduing of sin is at the heart of our flourishing. And the subduing and warfare language continues in the New Testament, but victory is won via the subduing of sin that is accomplished by God, Micah 7, and I think here Paul, everything in Colossians, which we then implement. As forgiven and blessed by God, our representational reign is funded by his sacrifice and blessings, and is focused on the flourishing of his kingdom, and is a light to the world, offering a glimpse of kingdom living. Thank you. So we got about 10 minutes for questions. We flew like the wind. I did this in 3 hours with a class a couple of days ago, so there's a little more here than we could do in time. So happy to take questions about any of these connections. Yes?
So you talked about early on what came to Genesis narrative mentioned that there are different types of makers. And I think we see like that as reflecting the image of God that we are makers and owners. But today I think we face a problem where we have a lot of consumers who don't really make and aren't able to own. What would the church's role be? Church's role should be in, I guess, directing our attention from consuming, but making and creating and investing owning property.
Yeah, I think a lot of the consumer maker divide it functionally in many cases is a similar form of idolatry. And I think it's helpful to look at Paul's body concept, right? So when he's dealing with a church, a lot of the issues that are occurring are because one member of the church wants to be the other thing that they've not been gifted. I want to be a hand instead of a foot. I want to be an eye instead of an ear. And so we have this sense of not operating within how God has gifted us. The primary way today that we attempt to change who we are is through consumption, so that the goods that I own form a sense of who I am. Well, both in the sense of, in the earlier lecture that I did with Commonweal a couple years ago, our identity is first and established, and it's from that identity then that we rule and we have our economic function within the world. So the text clearly distinguishes identity from function. So we've got to fix that, but then on the other side, even if we situate economics correctly, it has to be about flourishing of the community. And in those excessive consumer kind of things, I'm harming myself and the community by not contributing back in many ways. And sort of the shifting of the dollar around doesn't really lead to flourishing in any significant way. But it's primarily, I think, an issue of identity, where we need to come back to and help people think about the role of their economics as an expression of their identity, not as the source of their identity. So for some, it'll work out in, I think, in consumption. For me, and part of what you would see if you watch that other talk, is it worked out in angst about my vocation. The whole time I was working in the banking world, I was mad that I was not being paid by a church or a school, and was frustrated. I'm still doing ministry. God's blessing me. He's given me opportunities that I can't believe now, but I was mad because my paycheck came from the wrong place. So I think those kinds of things, primarily around identity and its role to economics, is one of the best ways that we can help our folks with those kind of questions. Yes?
Most companies today look at the bottom line as the chief objective. So working with a company that has that in view, where's the bite, where's the grab that you're going to help them to see that should be their ultimate
I think in part it helps that we have shifted primarily from a production to a knowledge economy. I think it's a little easier, whereby now you can really make the argument, and I think some top companies that are definitely not biblical companies, but they think this way, that people right now at an accounting level are an expense, not an asset. So expenses are things you try and minimize. But in all reality, in a knowledge economy, the people, their skills, the intellectual things they bring into it, you can make the same case, I think, at a physical level. So a craftsman who's doing fine woodwork, we've got a neighbor down the road who makes cabinets for $1 million homes. Well, it's him. He's the asset of that business, not necessarily as much the wood, because it won't build itself and I can't replace him. So I think in a knowledge economy, it's a little bit easier to begin to talk about people as assets and complementary partners. And a lot of, not large corporations, but a lot of smaller businesses do have a corporate model that thinks about partnership. You come and you want to ultimately join. A law firm might be one example of that. But the idea that you would do that. So I think helping people to see, and I think you can make this as a business case, that these are not expenses to be reduced, but assets on your book and assets you want to grow and enhance. And so I think we can do that. I think you can make the case in manufacturing. Part of the difference between where we are now and where we were, say, 30 or 40 years ago. 30 or 40 years ago, a company would hire you and train you with what they wanted. They just wanted to know your basic skills. Can you think? Can you work? We'll train you to do your job. Now the expectation is that you come fully formed with all the skills and knowledge, but now they can't find workers. So to see that worker as an asset they pour into and then build equity in them, as it were, I think that's part of this change that fits the biblical model, and it fits an economic one that works now in our contemporary economic setting, I think.
Dr. Thigpen, you talked about the difference in the definition of a successful business being making money for the shareholders. So if someone is a small business owner, does that then give them cause to think, maybe I shouldn't take the company publicly traded and create shareholders, because then I lose control of what I want it to be? If you're a family-owned company like a Hobby Lobby, maybe a Chick-fil-A or something, when you give up that center of mission, you open up to, seems like inevitable, just making the shareholders happy. So then as a small business owner, do they have to limit their own success in order to keep their mission, or what would you say about that?
I don't think so, because I think it is possible with a wisely selected board, and especially considering when it's initially set up, who owns a majority stake. So it's possible to go public and still own a majority stake in the company. But to have it set up in such a way that you talk about a value-added company and not shareholder. Most in the business world are beginning to see out of these that artificial inflation of stock price, simply then that your only value becomes we sell the company when it's starting to go belly up and reap that, is such a thin layer, and it's unsatisfying to the people who form the company, who work at the company. No one other than kind of at the stock trading level and the executives who benefit from it value that. So there can be a lot of shareholder value that takes place in other ways, rootedness in the community and those things. So I think it is possible, but it would have to be done with extreme care so that you don't lose that control. I think the other thing that we have to think about is to honestly press those people to realize that their work and their business is not their identity. So that if at some point they step away from that and it's gotten to a place that they want to do something else, their identity is not tied to that. It is rooted in their creation and their relationship with God, and that's one way they've represented Him, but they may not do that forever. So I'd want to be really careful to walk through that. That's especially for a small business owner. It's really hard to not see that company as an extension of yourself in that way, and I think we've got to create a little separation.